the way, even though this is on Facebook, what I do is I download it and upload it again to YouTube. So ever since I started doing the live, everything we've done live is on YouTube, because Facebook will eventually delete it. So if you miss a week or you don't do Facebook, you can do YouTube if you have internet. So what I can do is send the link, and that way you have access to it. So okay, let's pray, and then we're going to get into Leviticus 11. So, dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time of study. Lord, we pray that you just speak to us, that we learn about you, and that it drives us to worship you even more. Lord, I thank you for each lady that's here. I pray for those that are unable to make it for whatever reason, and we lift them up. Lord, we pray this in your holy name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so the next 5 chapters in Leviticus are all about being clean and unclean, ceremonial impurity. Now, unclean is not what we think of in English. It doesn't mean dirty. It means that you are either fit for God's presence or not fit for God's presence. Of course, with Jesus, that changed everything. They had to keep doing this every time something happened. They had to get clean again. Well, we are washed in the blood, and we're clean. So we're going to start with dietary laws. For the Jew, that means what's kosher. You've heard the word kosher. It means things you can eat. These laws were given to the children of Israel, not to the world. God was not telling the Greeks, you can't eat this. He was telling his Hebrew children.
So why was he differentiating on that?
Because they were his called, his chosen. He wanted them to stand out against the nations. Now, it doesn't mean some of these other nations didn't practice some of the same dietary laws, but these were specific to the Jews, and they were, it seems to be something they were good at keeping. You know, there's some things they weren't so good at, and some things they are. They still keep kosher laws.
Which is funny. The one thing they're going to listen to is food. Out of everything.
I know that you can't eat things.
Right.
But yeah, that's one of the things they listened to. Of course, there were periods of time that they didn't pay attention to any of the laws. But it's interesting what laws they still pay attention to. So we're going to go through these verses that are about the food. You'll notice there are no plants addressed. No plants. We're not, God didn't say you can't eat this plant, can't eat that plant. This is all animal. What's interesting is the order of animals in this chapter is the same order of animals in Genesis 1. Verses 20 through 30. Same order. Okay, and these are going to be big chunks of verses, so sorry. Verses 1 through 8. Okay, let's start with you.
Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having claws, hoof, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, this you shall not eat among those that chewing the cud and those that have claws, hoofs. The camel, because it chew the cud but does not have a claws, hoof, is unclean to you. The roc's
Here.
Yes, because it chews the cud, but does not have the cloven hooves. Is unclean to you the hair, because of it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves. It's unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having close hoof, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, in their carcasses you shall not touch, they're unclean to you.
Okay, one of the things that comes across in there, does God explain why on any of this?
Just set it, so do it.
Do you recall anyone saying, but God, why?
No.
They don't. God says it and they do it. That's pretty obedient. That's faith, obeying God without knowing why. Now that doesn't stop people from coming up with reasons why. But God doesn't have to explain himself. We try to make him, but he doesn't have to. Now, some of the things that do happen because they obey this is a demonstration of obedience to God. To do this, to set them apart as a holy nation. That's why he's given it to them and not the world. They are the holy nation. Like we've talked about, being obedient to God with your bellies, and that can be tough. This separated the Hebrews from the Gentile nations. I guess the Gentile nations like bacon a lot, but they don't get to have it. And these laws protect the health of the Jewish people. Yes. A lot of the things that are on this list were things that were not good for them to eat.
And today too.
Today too. Especially in those days, though, like pork, because we all know if you don't cook pork right, it's bad for you. So God was protecting them, making sure you're not going to eat the stuff that you have to be so careful about. So this list of animals starts with mammals because they were the most commonly eaten. So for the animals, the rules were different. He may not explain why, but he explains rules. He says you can't eat anything that has that doesn't have cloven hooves, and doesn't chew cud. So you can eat things that have cloven hooves and chew cud. But if it hits one or the other, nope, no eating. So it talks about cloven hooves. So that's a divided hoof. Horses don't have a divided hoof. Cows do. What's some other animals that do have divided hooves? Camels have divided hooves.
But they don't chew their.
But they don't chew cud. So the specific animals it mentions are those that are like half clean. They do one or the other. They either chew cud, don't have divided hooves, or have divided hooves but don't chew cud. So it was easier to mention the ones that are kind of questionable. If they hit both things, they were for sure. If they didn't hit both things, for sure no. It's the ones that were mixed that were a little confusing. So he explains which ones those are. Okay, so do we have anyone that grew up on a farm that can explain what cud is? Chewing cud?
Me? I was born.
It just regurgitate and chew the grass.
Yeah, and then they
swallow it and regurgitate.
Yeah,
Eat some
that's
more.
what chewing the cud is. Yeah, they eat their food and then they. Sounds gross, but.
But we can eat that.
Yeah. So it makes it where they can eat slowly. They regurgitate and eat it slowly. So any animal that didn't do that, they couldn't eat. But then we get these animals on the list that they can have that don't really, or they're the half clean because it says they chew cud, but they don't have cloven hooves. But we're thinking, rabbits? Do rabbits chew cud? They do not.
No.
Rabbits do not technically chew cud in today's, in the technical definition. But, you know, how they move their mouths and everything, that was, they believed they were chewing cud. Because
What's a rock badger?
a rock badger, it's an animal that lived in the desert rocks, and
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not the ones like around water.
no. So swine, pigs are especially singled out for being inappropriate, and they were popular animals in the Orient, in the Middle East. But they were raised and ate things that no other animal would eat.
Yeah.
So, and swine have divided hooves, but don't chew cud. So, on the no-no list. And of course, we know that pigs are the hosts of a lot of bacterial things which are not good, especially tapeworms. So, and it's found in poorly cooked pork. So, again, got off the
Because their skin doesn't have a or something.
yeah. Not only could you not eat an unclean animal, you were not to touch an unclean animal, living or dead, or you became unclean. And then you had to go through the cleansing stuff. Okay, so let's talk about water animals, verses 9 through 12.
These you may eat, whatever is in the water, all that have fins and scales, those in the water in the seas and the rivers you may eat. But whatever is in the seas and in the rivers that does not have fins or scales, among all these teeming life of water, and among all the living creatures that are in the water, they are detestable things to you, and they shall be harbored from you to you. You may not eat their flesh, their carcass, and their carcass shall detest. Whatever is in the water does not have fins and scales are harbored to you.
Okay, so basic rule for water animals. If it has fins and scales, you're good. If it doesn't have fins, doesn't have scales, no good. So, what's in the ocean that is not good for you?
Lobster, shrimp,
Yeah,
all the good stuff.
no, yeah. Dolphins, definitely not. Yeah,
So is it, okay, so it has to be both? It
Has to
have
be
scales
both.
and fins.
scales and fins.
Okay.
No catfish.
Yeah, catfish. I didn't know catfish don't have scales.
No.
When they're scavengers, so
Can't
it's
have
like they're like
squid.
pigs. They eat. Yeah,
Squid, no octopus,
unless they're
Yeah,
farm.
no turtles.
I know you're all gonna get to this,
I don't know.
but again, the reason for these rules at this point, we don't know. Now, they could have been for hygiene, they could have been for health. The most important part was God said, do this.
Yep.
So that they're set apart, because in Acts, everything's clean.
yes.
So, again, there are some very good reasons not to eat some of these things, but don't get so caught up in what it is. For them, they needed to know because God wanted them set apart. It could have been that some of these things had been offered to pagan idols. There were so it could have been so many reasons why God said this, and he never, like you said earlier, he never
Never
explains
explains
it. So they just had to obey. And so much so that in Acts, when God said, opened up the four corners and said, eat all of these, Peter said, I've never eaten any of this.
I wouldn't even think, or
No.
don't make me,
And he said,
poison
what
my
God
body.
calls clean, you don't call common. And so again, and his point there was another, to make sure they all knew that Gentiles were now clean.
yeah,
And there's rules in the New Testament about that you are free to eat things that have been offered to idols, but not in front of someone who wouldn't understand. Because it would cause them to stumble. So again, the whole point of this, more than anything, is God said you do it.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's what's important to us, is not to always think, well, God, why? Why can't I do that? Why can't I
Yeah.
go there? Why
I
can't
know our society today, we want to know why on everything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And then, but still, Orthodox Jews still follow.
Oh, yeah.
they do.
This-
Oh,
It
yeah.
hasn't
Yeah, because that
been
was Peter.
lifted from them.
Peter was talking
They-
to
yeah.
Just-
Christians, they still follow it.
Yeah.
And again, I think I've mentioned this before, there's an old book that I don't even think it's in publication anymore called None of These Diseases. And they've determined that all the laws that God had put placed at that time specifically for them, but even for today, that if we followed some of those, there would be some diseases that we probably wouldn't have.
Right.
But at the same time, again, the way that they had to prepare and store and everything else is so different than what we can do today.
Right.
So, yeah, we just need to be wise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I love bacon.
I'm glad I'm on this side of the cross.
And I'm glad
Yeah.
I am. And
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm free to eat bacon.
Like
And
Betty said the
lobster.
other week, we're glad we're on this side of the
Yes.
cross, not the other side.
Well, this side of the refrigerator.
Yeah.
Again, there's good reasons for some of these dietary, but that wasn't God's point.
No.
But it did save them though,
It did.
because they were obedient.
Okay, let's talk about birds now. Verses 13 through 19. And don't ask me what some of these birds are, but they're birds.
These are the birds you are to detest and not to eat because they are detestable: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hopo, and the bat.
Okay, and mine had ostrich in there for one of yours.
Yeah, mine did too.
So what's the rule about birds? See a rule?
Well, most of these
Scavengers.
are
Scavengers.
scavengers,
Yeah.
so we wouldn't.
But there's no like, they have to have 4 toes instead of 3, or their
No.
beak has to be
Right.
shaped this way. There's no rule about it.
These
So
are
he
some
gives
of the
the
ones you
list.
see on the road eating roadkill.
Yeah.
But to me, when I see these birds in their own natural habitat, they're so beautiful.
Oh, they
and
are beautiful.
So gracious
Especially the eagle.
that it just.
Yeah.
I
would
just
you
go,
want
who would want to eat it?
Because it's meat and you're starving.
Exactly, if you're desperate enough.
Yeah.
Get a plant.
A bat.
Yeah.
Kinds of berries.
I don't know of anyone who speaks of that.
Yeah. So there's 20 birds mentioned. They had to know.
I'm pretty sure in Ace Ventura too, they do that. They also eat the bat dung.
Who does?
It's a movie.
Yeah.
But it's like of another culture in another country where they idolize them, but they eat the dung and they eat the.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are.
Yeah. So some felt that the birds on this list drank blood, making them unclean.
Oh, no. That too.
A lot of them, when you think of all the owls, they like to hunt mice. And yeah, a lot of them are scavengers. In fact, sure Many of you heard that Ben Franklin thought it was stupid to have the eagle as a national bird because he's a scavenger. We should have had a turkey instead.
I'm glad you didn't choose a turkey.
Did you see a turkey on top of the flagpole?
Yeah.
The gold turkey on top of
And
the
all these
flagpole.
y'all mentioned, don't you see that a good
Well, and
reason
it's a-
for why we shouldn't eat them? Because they serve a great purpose in our,
Get rid of rats.
yeah, in our
Yeah.
environment, all
Yeah.
the scavenger. And so so the purpose of them not being eaten is so they keep everything else
Yeah.
clean. Yeah.
They're
And it's
God's
interesting,
garbage disposal. Yeah.
the ostrich, and it's kin to an emu, and my sister used to raise emus.
Uh-huh.
People use their eggs now, and I think they've been had some emu meat. She had some, I didn't eat it, but anyway, you know, and I know I had a cousin that get eggs from, ostrich eggs from somebody where they lived in Missouri, and their angel food cakes were like
Yeah.
this if she used the ostrich eggs.
It
and
is.
stuff.
I'll
So-
have to research on whether this also meant not their eggs. I would think it probably did.
That's still
Yeah.
a bird, technically.
Yeah. But there's lots of birds that aren't on this list. So you can
Chicken.
chicken, yeah.
And this comes on.
Any kind of poultry doesn't seem to be on there.
Just can I say something?
Of course.
The other day I read about this, and eagle, you know, in heaven, around there will be different creatures, you know, and then eagle is this fourth living creature, was like a flying eagle. So we can like them, but not for
They're-
eating.
They're very majestic looking.
Majestic looking.
Yes. Yeah, you think about the Roman culture, they idolized eagles.
Right.
And the Nazi
Just
eagles.
not to eat.
Yeah.
But they will be
Because they're
heaven.
majestic, but they don't eat the right things. Okay, so let's talk about bugs. Oh boy. Bugs. Okay, verses 20 through 23, Betty.
20, yeah, we are in 11.
Yes.
All the winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you.
I'm fine with that.
These you may eat among all the winged insects which walk on all fours. And you can eat those? Yeah. They walk on. Those which have above their feet jointed legs with which to jump on the earth. These of them you may eat, the locust in its kinds, and the devastating locust in its kinds, and the cricket in its kinds, and the grasshopper in its kinds. But all other winged insects which are four-footed are detestable to you.
I like the word detestable in here. Because, yeah, that's detestable to our culture. But they're in a desert environment. I could imagine bugs are life-sustaining, the right kind of insect. So you go to some cultures now and insects are,
But it doesn't mention anything like worms or anything that doesn't have wings. So are those considered unclean?
worms turn into butterflies. I don't know. I'll have to see what about
Crickets. What do you have to eat from crickets?
Right? That's,
You-
I wonder the nutritional value.
You can.
Well, they don't evaporate.
There's lots of people that do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Deep
Deep fried cricket.
Some people eat spiders.
Yeah. Okay.
Chocolate
So
covered ants, chocolate covered
Yeah.
grasshoppers.
okay. So any creeping animal was unclean. I mean, it talks a lot about 4 feet, but there aren't a lot of insects with 4 feet. It's more about how do they walk. Do they creep and crawl? If they creep and crawl on the ground, you can't eat them. So no chocolate covered ants. And it says no, one of the commentaries said no grubs, so that would mean no
Worms.
caterpillars or worms. Flying insects with jointed legs above their feet could be eaten. So all those grasshoppers and
Everything that
locusts
hops.
and anything that hops.
Like none of them.
John the Baptist
Locust.
ate
Yeah.
locusts. It says apparently they taste like crayfish.
They like chicken.
Like a little tiny piece of chicken.
But
You just want that
crayfish,
crunch,
you're not supposed
you
to
know?
eat crayfish because it doesn't have scales or
Yeah.
fins.
Well, they wouldn't know what crayfish tastes like, but we do. So it apparently tastes like that. So I guess we should say crayfish tastes like locusts. So again, this is more about how do the insects move. If they hop, you can eat them. If they don't hop, no. So we're back to rules again. Rules make it nice and clean. Okay, so now what happens when you eat or touch one of these things? It's verses 24 through 28.
By these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. The carcass of any animal which divides the foot, but is not cloven-hoofed, or does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Everyone who touches it shall be unclean. And whatever goes on its paws among all kinds of animals that go on all fours, those are unclean to you. Whoever touches any such carcass shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries any such carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It is unclean to you.
Okay, so even though you knew it would make you unclean, if there was a dead animal in the camp, you had to dispose of it. You couldn't just leave it in the camp. So you just sucked it up and became unclean and went through the ceremony to get clean again.
Like rock, paper, scissors to see who's gonna do it. I could see my kids
Possibly.
arguing over, I ain't touching it, no, you do it.
Yeah,
But that's just another the grace of God, that it was until evening. And he emphasized that over and over and over again,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
It
somebody
was-
has to do it.
yeah.
So.
You take them out. When you picked the animal up, it touched your clothing, you had to wash your clothing. If you were careful and didn't touch your clothing, you didn't have to wash your clothing. But you were unclean until evening, which meant you couldn't go to the tabernacle and you couldn't participate in worship things.
Even if you bathed before tabernacle, before the worship started,
It was
you still
a
couldn't go?
day. It was during the day.
Okay.
So I don't know if you picked it up in the evening, if that meant the next day or.
They just wait like an hour or two before.
I don't know. So imagine you're in an Israelite village and you find a dead rat. You have to promptly get rid of that rat.
Couldn't you just burn it?
Huh?
Couldn't you just burn it?
You'd have to
No,
pick it up
For them,
Probably.
they had to take it outside the camp.
Oh, okay.
and no
And clean it
shovels.
outside.
What if you had a shovel and you didn't touch it?
Or a big spoon or something.
If you,
Even
well,
primitive, no shovel.
They
yeah.
probably didn't have shovels.
So that uncleanness meant
Just obey.
short quarantine. So this is another rule that the Jews were really good about following. And in 1300, the Black Plague hit Europe. And it killed millions of people, but not the Jews, because they got rid of any rats that were in their city, in their part of town. In fact, it was so obvious that it wasn't happening to the Jews and it was happening to everybody else that the Christians blamed the Jews for the plague, said they were causing it,
Seems reasonable.
that it had to be some kind of magic. No, they were following a good principle. I mean, it's a good principle now.
I heard about
Don't leave dead rats laying around.
And if you do, wash yourself.
Yeah. Someone in the Bible who didn't obey this law about touching dead animals, Samson, because he took honey out of the carcass of a lion, an unclean animal. So he wasn't so good about obeying that law. He wasn't so good about obeying a lot of things. But, so what happened when you became unclean? How do you get clean? Again, you wash your clothes if whatever dead animal touched your clothes. If it didn't, you don't have to wash your clothes. Then you're excused from worship for this period of time. Now, teenagers probably, maybe they were jumping at, hey, I don't have to go to church.
That's what I was just thinking, Jonathan.
Yeah, here, let me take it.
No, because then he'd have to bathe. Boys don't like that.
If you used a vessel, here comes the shovel thing. If you used a vessel to carry the dead animal, if it was something that would soak in, like clay, you had to break it. Couldn't be used ever again. If it was something that wouldn't soak up, then you just had to clean it. So again, you know, it was good sanitation that God was doing. But again, he doesn't explain all that to them. They just obey.
And this is the first time that they're talking about animals that have paws.
Yeah. And they didn't cover it before because they don't have cloven hooves, so they're automatically off the list. And they don't chew cud.
So you think, you know, dogs, cats, bears.
Yep. Yep. All off because they don't have cloven hooves. None of them. So, deer. Deer have cloven hooves, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think they chew cud.
So they're good to eat.
Okay, let's look at verse 29 and 30.
And these are unclean to you among the swarming things that swarm on the ground, the mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard of any kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon.
So they have to talk about these things because there's lots of those guys around.
Yeah.
And
They were all over the desert.
Yeah. Now the creeping things like the mouse and the mole were already covered under the thing with not a cloven hoof and no chewing cud. But they're repeated for clarity. Don't eat those things.
Well, and they must have swarmed because this is talking about swarming ones. So,
Because,
like,
they travel in big packs
whole
together. Yeah.
group of them together.
And then we get the lizards. Don't eat lizards.
Can't even look at them.
We're all okay with not eating lizards, right?
There goes my lunch plan.
Where do you eat?
Okay,
I
versus...
used to be a vegetarian.
I know, yeah, see? He didn't cover any plants because plants were good. Although there are plants that aren't good for you, but I guess they knew which ones those were. But, yeah, so...
Natural selection.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at verses, is that a repeat? 31 through 38. Get a check.
Okay.
Mia's eyes.
Of all those that move along the ground, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean till... Sorry.
That's okay.
Brought to the priest is to examine them and wait.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That doesn't connect.
There. Okay, unclean till evening. When one of them dies and falls on something that article, whatever it's used will be unclean, whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth. Put it in water, it will be unclean till evening. and then will be clean. If one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food you are allowed to eat that has come in contact with water from such pot is unclean, and any liquid that is drank from such a pot is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on becomes unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken up. They are unclean, and you are to regard them as unclean. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean, but anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seed that are to be planted, they are remain clean. But if water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you.
Okay, so hygienically speaking, these laws make a lot of sense. So they required, for example, that if a rodent crawled across the bowl, you got rid of the bowl. Now you can imagine they didn't like having to get rid of bowls because then they'd have to make a new one. So they were really careful about rat populations.
Okay, they didn't have cupboards like we did. They left their stuff all in the open, and at night, how could they tell?
Well,
Yes, if it was droppings in it or something that you could see that the animals left, you would get rid of it.
I don't know.
But would they really? I guess they would. Otherwise, God
I would
could
think
sap
they
them
had
dead.
cloth that they put across.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
had
some
the
kind of
sackcloth
I'm sure,
or
yeah.
something.
Yeah, I'm sure they did that because they must not like having to get rid of their stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that meant they were really careful about keeping rats away and mice and things.
And sometimes rats and mice leave their little calling cards so you know they've been out.
Yeah. If they touched food or drink, had to throw whatever that was out. I'm sure they didn't like doing that.
Good rules.
Yeah. Cooking utensils, if they touched an unclean animal, get rid of it. So what an incentive to prevent pests. So one different thing was water. If water was in a jar and standing still and something unclean touched it, you had to get rid of it. But if it was in a cistern or like a river or anything else like that, it didn't make the water unclean because it was flowing. So it was ritually still clean.
Makes sense, so it's
Yeah.
always going, so it's.
Yeah.
you're
Then they
always
have this
getting a clean
interesting thing
current.
about seeds. Seeds that came in contact with a carcass, they stayed clean unless they had been watered. Because once they've been watered, then they will start sprouting. As long as there's still seeds that haven't been watered, you didn't have to throw them out. So again, great incentives for keeping clean. And yeah, it must have been really tough. Because not only while they were traveling through the desert, again, a lot of these laws were meant to take real effect once they got into the land, but they live in a land though that I'm sure is full of these things, and they've got to keep it clean. Okay, verse 39.
And if any animal which you may eat dies, whoever touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening.
Oh, I'm sorry, and 40.
And whoever eats of its carcass shall wash his hands and be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening.
Okay, so this is about roadkill. Don't eat roadkill, basically. And anyone that handled these ceremonially unclean carcasses, they were unclean and had to go through the many period of not being allowed to go to the tabernacle to worship, the brief quarantine. Ren, are you okay with reading? Okay, verses 41 through 43.
All the carcasses that swarm on the earth are detestable and must not be eaten. Do not eat any of the carcasses that swarm on the earth. Anything that moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet, for they are detestable. Do not become contaminated by any creature that swarm. Do not become unclean or defiled by them, for I am Yahweh your God. So you must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. You must not defile yourselves by any swarming creature that crawls on the ground. For I am Yahweh, brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. So you must be holy, because I am holy.
Okay, so again, we've seen all these animals back up in verses 20 through 30, but repeated for clarity. And you know the rule for repetition. If it's repeated, it doubles the importance. Pay attention to these things. Eating these things was considered an abomination, equal to idol worship. They took it seriously. And then God claims the right to speak to every area of our life, including what we eat. He had the right to tell Israel what to eat, what not to eat, without explanation. And they seem to have accepted that. Amber, can you finish up the chapter for us?
This is the law about beast and bird and every living creature that moves through the waters and every creature that swarms on the ground, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the living creature that may be eaten and the living creature that may not be eaten.
Okay, one of the main purposes of these dietary laws is to have the nation of Israel stand out as different, as God's chosen people, to provide them a healthy lifestyle. We see this in Daniel 1, when Daniel and his friends refused to eat the Babylonian food, and they were healthier. What would that mean for us if we did that? God blessed them for being righteous and eating as he had commanded. So among the unclean animals, they generally fell into three categories. You had the predators that would eat the flesh and blood of animals. Pretty much those were all off the list. You had the scavengers that would go eat whatever remained of those animals. They carried a lot of disease. And then you had potentially poisonous animals like shellfish and swine. So generally the unclean animals fall into those categories. But again, God doesn't say don't eat them because they might poison you. He just says don't eat them. He claims their obedience. They were obligated to God because God had done so much for them. And he was God. There's some Christians that believe we have to obey these dietary laws today, but these were specifically given to the children of Israel. Again, in Acts, we see Peter given the command that everything is clean now. At the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, they settled it too. They determined that obedience to Moses, to the laws of Moses, wasn't required of the followers of Jesus. So we are free to eat what we want or whatever we please. Yet God still wants us to be healthy. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, whatever therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. Okay, Leviticus 12, fun chapter. It's all about us women. It's a short chapter, 6 verses. So let's do 3/4 of the chapter and verses 1 through 4.
The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over.
Okay, does God say why the woman's unclean? It's again one of those things that God says, and you do. But she was probably considered unclean because she bled. Another theory is that because she gave birth to someone that sinned, because of original sin, because of her, there's more sin in the world. That was something that was in a lot of commentaries. That's something that came up.
Well,
So maybe sin by proxy. I mean, she gave birth to a sin.
If she
which
didn't
made
get,
her unclean.
if no woman ever had another baby, that would stop the sin in the world. Because if once everybody died off, there'd be no more sin. So, yeah, I was way thinking. So after giving birth to a boy, she was ceremonially unclean for 7 days. The first 7 days is a total separation, her and the baby away from everybody during the first week. Even her husband didn't come and eat and drink with her. There were people that would come bring her food and things, but they became unclean when they came to visit her. So they had to go through this ceremonial stuff. Then the baby was circumcised on the 8th day. Do you see the story of Jesus in here too? After the circumcision, her uncleanness lasted another 33 days for a total of 40 days. But the second period wasn't as confining. She just couldn't touch anything holy or enter the sanctuary at that time. Now, this purification time wasn't a negative thing. It was a great time of bonding with that baby. She got to spend time with that baby. It's the equivalent of a modern maternity leave, or whatever the leave is after a baby is born, or bonding time. No social obligations. Didn't have to go to parties. Didn't have to go anywhere. Mothers welcomed this time of rest and seclusion, and someone was coming to take care of her. I know, that sounds pretty good to me. But,
I think so. Something to add. It just reminds me. I don't know how I was here, but in my country, when I had baby, I have to stay 7 days in the hospital, and husband couldn't come and see. I just through the window show baby. No family.
Yeah.
And how about here? Did you stay longer in hospital?
Oh, they kick you out after the first day.
No, but before.
Well, when my kids were born, it was 3 days, and I managed to get 4 days out of one of them. Because I said, please don't send me home.
I
It
had
was my third.
C-section and only had 4 days because
Yeah.
I didn't have any insurance.
But they said that time in my country because of hygiene, because I don't know, but For me, it was all.
Difference between five.
Yeah. Okay, so again, Mary, the mother of Jesus, fulfilled these obligations. Okay, now, verse 5.
But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood after purifying for 66 days.
Okay, for a girl, double the time. Why? Does God say why?
No.
Of course, everybody's come up with conjecture about why, but God doesn't say why. Again, got the idea that she brought a sinner into the world. Well, now she brought the future creator of another sinner into the world.
Or also, because she maybe will bleed eventually as well.
Yeah.
Well, and Eve was the one who actually sinned first, and this is the daughter.
Yeah.
It all goes back to her.
Yeah.
That darn apple. One good apple or fruit, whatever it was.
Yeah.
None of this says she was sinning. It just says she was unclean.
Yeah.
No, yeah. This doesn't say she's
Doesn't talk about
sinning.
forgiveness
So
or
again,
anything
it's conjecture. Another possibility that's been suggested is that because girls were considered weaker than boys, it allowed the mother more time with the daughter, so that she could focus her care and attention on the daughter. Another idea was that her son would basically be taken away from her as he grew. He would be raised by the men. Her daughter would be raised by her, give her extra time with that daughter. Again, doesn't say any of that. So
It makes sense though with the boy, because he's going to be circumcised on 8 days, that would be a emphasis there. So all of that can take place with the boy at that time. The girl doesn't have to have that. And there are some cultures though that circumcise girls.
yeah.
And so this definitely would set them apart, that no way would the girl
Yeah,
have anything to do with that.
girls are still in the... Okay, let me finish this chapter. Oh, I was wrong. It's 8 verses. Okay, and when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall become clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. And if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves and 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. So this atonement thing, fairly standard sacrifice we've seen before, holding the woman symbolically responsible for bringing another sinner into the world. She had to bring a year-old lamb, making the dedication of the child to God, and she had to bring a young pigeon or a turtle dove to make atonement. Same for boys or girls. Something nice to know, we'll only see information about the flow of a woman's blood one more time in this chapter. So God, of course, knows not every family could afford a lamb. So he again makes allowance for the poor. A lesser sacrifice of 2 turtle doves and 2 young pigeons. What did Mary and Joseph bring? I've heard some conjecture that Joseph was actually fairly well off. If he was well off, he would have brought a lamb. He would have had to bring a lamb. They were bringing the sacrifice for the poor, so they didn't have a lot of things. This was obviously also before the Magi came, so they didn't have any of those rich things anyway. So this sacrifice marks the end of the ceremonial purity impurity, and she is now considered clean. So she can go back to society.
Go back to cooking and
Yeah, go back to the group. It's like, oh, please let me stay. Okay, so next week we're going to be talking about swords and leprosy. Kind of reminds me of, I've never watched it because I've never wanted to do Dr. Pimple Popper. The Dr. Pimple Popper chapter. That'll be next week. So, okay, I'm going to turn off the camera so you can do prayer requests. Bye, everybody.